Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to have Florian Idenburg with us tonight. Oh, you took off your jacket. It's very cold here in Miami. After working in Amsterdam and Tokyo, Florian founded So Ill together with Jing Liu in New York in 2008. Florian's practice is collaborative. He believes that innovation is possible only through working together. This way of working has been not only widely acknowledged, but also tested internationally. Amongst others, So Ill have realized projects in the US, in China, in South Korea, and I think soon in Australia, but you will tell us more about it. Florian combines a pragmatic approach with a theoretical drive, establishing a strong position in teaching at institutions like Harvard, MIT, Columbia, and Princeton University. His current research investigates the future of the workspace, and he is developing a publication on this topic called Humans Work, I believe. In 2017, So Ill published a visual and written manifesto, Solid Objectives, Order, Edge, Aura. In this publication, there are many intriguing ideas that touch upon our kind of loose topic of the long now. For example, it formulates arguments against the stable, the monumental, and the explicit, against also, and we discussed a bit about that today, the nostalgic architects that are strung out by globalization, romantically reviving the past. And also, but towards a construction of new wilderness that weaves our contemporary lives together in vibrant inexactitudes. So we are thrilled to have him with us tonight. Please welcome Florian.
Thank you. So I came in and landed at 2, and I was still editing this lecture in the car here. It's the first time I'm going to tell this story. Sometimes I remember once seeing Tadao Ando lecture, and I saw him lecture again like 3 years later, and he made the same jokes. And I thought it was time for some new jokes for me. But maybe there's a little bit less jokes now than in the lectures I used to have, because I don't know, we are in our second decade. And I have a little bit more of a reflexive and reflective and maybe contemplative lecture prepared for you tonight. So let's see how that goes. 2008 is when we started. Jing Liu, my partner, she's from China, I'm from the Netherlands. We called ourselves Solid Objectives with the idea that we really wanted to engage with the real, the solidification of objectives, the building of buildings, the engaging with reality. We maybe, coming from these countries, believe that architecture needs to operate within reality, within society, within the public realm. And so when we started in 2008, that was our ambition, and a month later, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and a third of the architects lost their job, half of the architects in New York closed. But that was actually a new, because of that there was a new space maybe, and because we were frugal and young, we were able to set up a practice that ultimately in the last 10 years actually was able to realize a few projects that I will not be talking about today, such as this gallery in Korea, our first project, or the museum at UC Davis, a museum for art that tries to, in some way, reduce the threshold between campus and gallery, or temporary structures such as the Frieze Art Fair, or this sort of new home, mini housing in Milan. And now we're working on institutional work and homes, sometimes fancy homes. But I wanted to talk about something else today, and it relates to some of our temporary work and the work we continue to do as sort of lightweight temporary installations. Because now, if we follow the news and if we see what is happening in the world, it seems that people are really, really angry and very upset. And the public is frustrated with certain ideas about access to jobs, access to power or places for opinion, the way, you know, we're dealing with our environment. I was saying I have 4 plastic bottles here of water for this lecture, and shouldn't we think about those issues more? And I was just in the Lisbon Triennial last week, where architects are very interested in keeping things remain the same. Architects are very interested these days in representation, but representation very much on their social media feeds, trying to make the best sort of single point, flattened perspectives, you know, that get a lot of likes. And shouldn't we not think more about how we actually deal with real space, not just virtual space? And what are the elements, what are the forms of occupation, what are the objects, what are the design problems here? And Jing and I discuss a lot, and we are also wondering if this public sphere that we are seeing now, that is dealing with all these sort of single topic issues in which, again, identity and representation comes through colors, through elements, through hats or yellow vests. And so what can we do within this space where really our buildings are becoming places that are contested, where, you know, histories are hidden or are wrong or need to be retold? And I think what we are or have always been interested in is figuring out how to deal with the public realm, not as a single sort of public, but as multiple publics, a space in which we as people can actually accept our differences, but also find a way to interact with one another. And so there's 3 temporary projects. One is our first, actually, but that all deal with different approaches maybe that we think we could deal with, or we could engage, or could sort of contemplate or develop as architects, that in some way deal with that public realm and that are able to deal with this question of what does it mean, you know, today to operate as a human within sort of a civic society. And so the first project, maybe some of these people, some of you have know about the MoMA PS1 project. We won that in 2009, and we made an installation. And the installation is built on the legacy of Bauhaus ideas, because you built for the MoMA, and the MoMA is the sort of treasurer, if you want, of the modern movement and these ideas that we can actually design a society. And we were interested in Oskar Schlemmer, a choreographer who thinks about this relationship between humans and structure, and how these structures connect us, and the interrelationship between us, technology, and society. And so we took over, we took the courtyard of PS1 and installed an installation that is, as Charlotte said, unstable, always on the verge of collapse, but where, you know, we as users, as audience, as people are responsible for its stability, very much like society itself. And so a very simple, weak structure with a series of elements or objects in that don't necessarily, you know, tell a singular story, that don't prescribe a singular use, but that actually invite people to figure out, to discover new types of engagement. And so this installation triggered uses we had not anticipated, games that, you know, we hadn't thought about, and interactions that and relationships that we didn't had premeditated. So the idea of an open structure and an idea of play as a way to have people engage with each other. Maybe a lesser known project we did, I think the same year or a year later, also in Queens, is a project, and I see it's very low-res, the image, but it is a project we did in Jackson Heights for the Guggenheim Museum, a temporary, most ephemeral installation. Jackson Heights, Queens, is the most, apparently most diverse neighborhood in the US, 167 languages spoken. And the Guggenheim curator at that moment asked us and asked a number of architects and artists to look at the different boroughs and come up with an idea of how to find stillness and quiet in sort of the intensity of our urban life. And because of this, the extremely diverse community and these different languages, we got really interested in this idea of using words and using stories and using narratives in a way to create space, to create sort of an escape. And so we spent a lot of time in the neighborhood listening to people and listening to their stories. And we realized that Jackson Heights is really a neighborhood of transition where people come in. It's a lot of people, their first sort of stop into the US is in Jackson Heights. And so this idea of finding home away from home, from all different perspectives, is something that we felt we need to try to develop narratives around. And so we commissioned 12 different people from the neighborhood, citizens from the neighborhood, priests, musicians, poets, writers, to tell a story, basically to write a story about this idea of transition and about an idea of homecoming. The installation was called Transhistoria. And then we designed one simple element, which is a stool, a blue little stool, and we spread them out over the neighborhood, and we worked with a number of volunteers. Then there was an app or something online that indicated where you could go, and if you would sit down on these chairs, on streets and on parks, somebody would come, and it would come and tell you a story.
This was Fani's first winter in New York and his second apartment. Before this one, he'd lived with his brother, an arrangement that worked for some time until his brother resumed his old habit of constantly drinking alcohol, having established which bars nearby would be most accommodating of his limited English and short temper. Shortly after finding his brother had torn his second and last shirt in an altercation with a downstairs neighbor, Fani decided it was time to find a place of his own. He had worked this out with his brother's old landlord, Mr. Borenstein, who had always liked Fani despite, or in contrast to, his brother's constant inebriation. Another apartment was available in Jackson Heights, and Mr. Borenstein assured him it would be perfect for Fani and his wife, who had arrived shortly from India. This is where Fani found himself that morning, drinking tea and waiting for his wife to come back from Patel Brothers. He figured the tea would keep him warm and the caffeine would fuel his search for their cat, which had gone missing somewhere in their small apartment. She had gone out hours earlier while he was asleep to buy groceries. He wasn't sure how long it had been. He figured it was at most 2 hours. Since waking, he had drank, by his estimate, 3.5 cups of tea. He had not yet begun to look for the cat, which had not appeared when he set out its food. He had begun to suspect that he did not like this cat. It was his wife's cat. They had found it together, decided to keep it together, but it was not his cat, it was hers. He suspected this was because he left for work each morning before the sun rose and arrived back shortly after sunset.
We have to listen to the whole story because I can't turn it off.
And his wife, who had not yet found employment, got to spend them with the cat.
I think it's 2 minutes.
They hadn't named the cat. They claimed they should wait until they thought of something perfect. His wife said cats don't respond to their names the way that dogs do, that they might never really learn their names. But he refused to believe that people would keep animals that didn't know their own names. Of course, his real reason for not naming the cat was that he didn't plan on keeping it for very long. He got up to go to the bathroom. Fani had a habit since coming to America of peeing in the sink. He would lock the door behind him and pull up the toilet seat loudly so everyone outside would hear it bang against the toilet tank and safely assume he was using it, and then he would pee into the sink. After waiting some time, he would wash his hands and come out. A few weeks after moving into the apartment, Fani's wife caught him in the act. He had forgotten to lock the door. Disgusting, she said. How can you do that? It's unsanitary. But he claimed he was saving water, that Americans were a wasteful lot, and that all the pipes were the same. But since being caught, Fani modified his plan by incorporating a pointless flush into his routine a few seconds after using the sink in his usual fashion, wasting the water he had wanted to save.
So the interest here was also in the idea of creating space with words, right? What is the lightest sort of material that you can have to create a space around you, a space of escape? And so a story can be such space. And the last temporary or ephemeral installation. And these, I think, three things I'm showing because they will inform the rest of the talk, because they allow us to contemplate concerns in society. Is the installation we did for the Chicago Biennial 2 years ago, where, and maybe again sort of as a reaction to the quite nostalgic theme, which was Let's Make History, I think, we were asked to do an installation in Garfield Park on the west side of Chicago, in a neighborhood that is has the highest homicide rates in Chicago, but it is in this beautiful botanical garden in Garfield Park that has been there for a very long time, in this sort of beautiful glass bubble in this quite tough neighborhood, in which suddenly you find this oasis of nature. And so we worked together with an artist, Anna Pravacci, and through dialogue and conversation, we started to think about this idea of cocooning and layering, and also this idea of air and cleanliness and breath, and the role of nature and our relationship to our environment. And so we called the installation L'air pour l'air, as a critique on sort of this idea of architecture for architecture's sake. We thought of air for air's sake, and we worked. We asked a composer, Veronica Krausas, to compose a piece that was for 4 wind instruments, so 4 instruments that need the air in order to perform. And she wrote a piece, and we then made these enclosures that you see here, and they're made out of air filtering material. They're actually the stuff you put in your HVAC unit to clean the air. And so the idea is, and as you see, there's 4 instruments. In the left is the soprano, this is the trombone, the flute, and the saxophone. They have the shape of the ergonomics of the movement of the musician, that they need the space that they need, the air that they occupy in order to perform. And so the idea is that as they play and as they breathe the air, they actually filter the air. So by performing, they clean the air. And I'm going to play a part of this now as well. So with those three things by way of maybe introduction, I'm going to share a number of projects that we are working on currently that I don't think we have shown before. But so if we say summarize these concerns with, one is how do we engage, with each other? What is the way in which we interact with the public? The second, sort of how do we tell, different stories, stories from different points of view? And the third, maybe, how do we deal with our environment? And so we set out this summer, actually, with the family, because apart from professional partners, we're also life partners and have 2 kids. We thought it would be good to make a trip through the Rust Belt of the United States to figure out, what is, in a way, the sort of the history, the legacy of industry here, the place of jobs, the place of work, the idea of city building and civic work, specifically because we are involved in a bunch of projects in not all these towns, but these are all the stops, but actually, so we won't stop at every stop, but in some way we have something to do in these different towns. And we realized there's a relationship and we're trying to discover that. And so we started at, of course, the capital of New York State, Albany. And I don't know if people know this project, the Governor Nelson Rockefeller Empire State Plaza, built in between 1965 and 1976, $2 billion and housing various departments of New York State. And so to build this, so some of the talk will be about the idea of sort of city making, state making, nation building, power, energy, jobs, and economy. Here, 7,000 people were pushed out to build this sort of proud capital. It was very poorly received. It sort of killed downtown Albany. And Paul Goldberger said it was sort of not what the future. This is not what the future will look like, but this is actually sort of a monument to the past. But so Rockefeller was, a strong governor at that moment, who was involved in a number of large projects. And so one of the projects we're currently working on has its history and has its place here. Where this is Buffalo, the next stop along the Niagara Gorge. In 1956, there was a rock slide. So basically, all energy and all power that feeds the state of New York and creates a lot of jobs is hydropower that comes out of the Niagara Gorge. And so in 56, there was a disaster. This energy plant crashed, and immediately there was a threat that all industry would leave the region that Buffalo and its surroundings made so powerful. And so there was an emergency Congress meeting, and the Niagara Redevelopment Act was passed in 1957. And there was the Federal Power Commission commissioned Robert Moses, who you see here on the left, to build this gigantic power plant a little bit downstream from Niagara Falls. And this is the opening 3 years later, where Rockefeller again is pulling the switch and bringing power back to the area. And at that moment, this is the largest power facility in the world. Kennedy called it an example to the world of North American efficiency and determination. And so in order to build this hydropower plant, they needed to dig a big hole. And that hole you see here on the right. And so before this could be dug, there was a community of Native Americans living there, the Tuscarora Nation, and they were displaced. They had to move, and this was fought all the way up to the Supreme Court, but in the end, sort of industry and power and state making, and Robert Moses was able to build this thing at the cost of Native Americans having to move. What also needed to move is all the soil that was being excavated out of this hole, and it needed to be dumped somewhere. And that dump is right there, and that's our site for a current project. It was dumped in a town called Lewiston, and I forgot the amount of cubic yards and containers and trucks that was all dumped there, but here you see the dump site, and there you see the lake behind. And so what happened after, in sort of 10 years, the site became an experimental site for land artists. They turned it into a park, right? It's like they brought in the artist in a way to do something with it. And so in 1974, 1 year after Robert Smithson's death, they opened Art Park with the artist residency program, and a lot of the land art and land artists actually started there. And so it was an experimental site for land art. On the left, you see the power plant being collapsed. On the right, you see an installation by Gordon Matta Clark called Bingo, in which he sort of threw things down the gorge. It was a site also where Chris Burden dropped beams, and also it was a place where a lot of female artists and environmental artists started to experiment with the landscape. Michelle Stewart was one of the artists there. Also Nancy Holt, Robert Smithson's widow, was also involved in building there. And also the start of this environmental art. This is the Pool of Virgin Earth by Alan Sunfest, who basically just made a circle of rocks and let seeds sort of capture it and start to grow. And he claims that this is the way in which ultimately this mound of dirt was fully grown into a landscape. And so over the years, this site developed into a real sort of artist destination. And then there is a whole other aspect that developed, which is the theater, which you see here up front. And this is a good example, again, of, say, governmental maybe overreach and underpay. But basically there was a performer who wanted to do an outside performance there, and he contacted Earl Bridges, who was the state senator at the moment, to see if they could use the site to do this performance. And he said, why don't we, if we just do one outside performance, why don't we build a grand theater that can accept opera and ballet and everything, that nature or that culture has to offer. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of money. And so the structure was built, but without actually being fully enclosed. So there's no climatization, which is not useful for Albany or the climate over there. Also, there's no dressing rooms, there's no foyer. It's just basically a stage with a fly tower and 2,400 seats covered, from the rain. There was a crisis. People said they didn't know what to do. Everybody left the project, and ultimately what they decided to do is reinvest or invest much more money in the surroundings to make this art park. And so for 10, 15 years, it was a very successful place for performances, but more sort of in the periphery. Yet over time, and this is where we come in and where we found it, the park sort of lost really its use, funding dried up, and it is now pretty much empty, except for 12 classic rock concerts every year. So it's 12 times per year occupied. And recently we saw Sammy Hagar there. And Sammy Hagar, at 71, said to his audience, which is also pretty much 75 and up, he said, "You guys don't go fucking die on me because I want to come back here for another 10 years. But sort of this is the problem that they have, is that both, and this is what our director there said, is both our audience and the acts are dying. And so what are we going to do with this place? This was a competition we won, and we won it mostly through a number of conversations. But what we realized was that this is not so much about making a master plan. It's not so much about sort of exactly what they did wrong there, which is just planned things that don't necessarily were needed. We work together. This is ongoing. We're actually in the middle of the process. We're working together with West 8, a landscape firm, maybe best known from Governor's Island. I wanted to work with them because they are very good at also dealing with the artificiality of landscape, or this relationship between, say, nature and like constructed nature. It's originally a Dutch firm, and 80% of the Netherlands is actually constructed landscape. And we also work with Charcoal Blue, a theater consultant, and very good group that really knows how to think about performance space and performance spaces. And what we realized is we shouldn't just come and make a plan. The most important thing is actually to go into the community and really have many conversations and listen and work with people and let people actually have these conversations. So going back to games and going back to interactivity, we developed a series of games and other sort of tools in which people could actually start to have conversations about what needs to happen here. Because ultimately you can make a plan, but if the community itself is not sort of embracing it, and if it's not their plan, then there's absolutely no need to bring that in. And so the processing and the documenting and then the sort of synthesizing of these stories and of these ambitions and of these hopes is actually the main sort of way to develop the project. But we also did is actually, study the site not just from sort of this one history, this constructed history, but also understanding, what for other publics and other populations this land is. And so obviously we also engaged with Native Americans to sort of understand how they used and see the land and which places actually can be touched and which ones can't. And there's the one area that is a very unique mound and other areas that we literally will not be able to deal anything with and we need to let rest. And so also engaging with possible future performers. This are the group Charcoal Blue talking to some of our future possible artists and other users that will come back to the area, and also really understanding what is in the ground, what is in the soil, and so the whole sort of timeline and digging, and there was no records of any of this. So really understanding how is this completely constructed landscape, what are actually the different layers and the different stories and the different, say, histories that are buried here. And along this thinking of sort of these different histories that are embedded within the land, and understanding that every landscape is actually a constructed one. We were interested in discovering, and maybe people know this, but for us it was completely new, that also the Niagara Falls not far can be turned off actually. It's completely sort of controlled, and in 1969 they actually turned it off. There were engineers trying to clean up. They apparently found some bodies, but they also were trying to see how they could improve and beautify the way the water came down. And so now we're working on a proposal or on the scheme that in some way tries to make legible these different layers, makes legible the history of the land, and actually strengthened its experience. So the red sort of path, which is the main artery of the site, is actually the way the trucks drove down with their radius. It's the sort of switchback that was necessary for the trucks, and the different layers of the sort of plateaus that were there, which had sort of been overgrown over time. We want to bring back so that you see sort of the idea of this constructed landscape. And so we're playing with this idea of what is actual real nature or what is constructed nature. And then we have a very light touch with regards to our installations. We're not moving lots of earth or making another sort of constructed landscape. It is more revealing the different histories that have taken place. They're making sort of soft enclosures, creating new spots and new spaces, and using actually the dramatic qualities of the gorge, and so that people can really experience this sectional landscape. And the main, and here I unfortunately cannot show you how far we are, because this is something we haven't presented to the people themselves yet, but we will do very soon. The main thing we will be doing is rebuilding, but in a much more, I would hope, engaging way, the amphitheater for 10,000 people that can see sort of the gorge as they enjoy the future or next Sammy Hager. So then we drove on and we went to Cleveland. Cleveland, obviously, at some point was the 6th biggest city in the US, the city of steel. And all these cities, they all have their own industries, right? They all have their own sort of focus, and they all created their own power and their own wealth and their own, generations, all controlling certain types of industries, and they all worked together. And here in Cleveland, we're working in an area called University Circle on the Martin Luther King library for the Cleveland Public Library system. And the site is interesting because it's at the end of Euclid Avenue, and Euclid Avenue, which is basically, it's from here outward towards the city. So this is downtown Cleveland. Here's Lake Erie. This is sort of its second downtown. But before it was the case, and when Cleveland was booming about a century and a half ago, the new wealth class, they created Millionaires Row along Euclid Avenue, and it was called the Champs-Élysées of the United States. And actually, Rockefeller, who we just saw, his grandfather built a house here because he started Standard Oil, which obviously we all know what that became. And now, over time, that area sort of, the city pushed into this area and people left. And so it's an interesting area where there is a hybrid of like great mansions, great parks. Many of the people and the industry that lived there, they founded institutes such as the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is nearby. There are universities and other places, but at the same time, it's sort of an area that has both this legacy, and at the same time, it has a lot of sort of empty lots and empty sites. And now the city is trying to, with help of the Cleveland Foundation, to bring in sort of new life into this area. Also, the Museum of Contemporary Art by Farshid Mousavi is in this area. And so we were asked to join, no, actually we applied to join a competition. We made it to the shortlist, and then we end up winning it, to relocate the library, a library that was built in the 70s, right around the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and it was built in his legacy, the Martin Luther King branch for the Cleveland Public Library system. And you see here on the left the sort of civic idea that the architects had with public life and sort of people branching out of the library. But on the right, the reality, it's a beautiful, sort of decent building, but in some way it's not sort of living up to this promise of public life, because basically there is not much public life around it. It's used by different demographics. There are poor neighborhoods nearby that use the library for also people spend just the day there, specifically on hot days, and then there is the university audience that comes sometimes and study. And it's a small space, but a space in which many different audiences come together. But in this development, is now a plan to relocate the library. This is where the old library is. This is where the new library will be, around the corner. But obviously, this needs to be done with a private investor who can then develop things around it. So he gets the air rights of the library as long as he builds the library back there. And again, through engaging with many of the constituents and organizing many different conversations around what the future library would be, we developed a plan really through engaging with these audiences. And so, the library is transforming. A library is not just a place to find books, or actually is less and less a place to find books, but it is much more, because we live in a time now of information abundance. And so the library is transforming from a place for consumers to also a place for creators. And actually, it's really interesting. If you visit the libraries now, it's very much more about access to tools. It's about giving people who don't have access to these tools at home a way to connect to systems, to tools, to the, say, the infrastructure that allows society to function. And so for many people, it's also sort of the last straw that they have to hold on to actually, continue to be connected to jobs, to being a participant in society. And so this shift also from learning from books, from learning from each other, it was really important for us in the thinking about this, that this would be a place to gather people around, to have conversations, to be actually a library of production and a library of, say, civic discourse. What we did, so we first created at least a very big canopy that would allow the sort of private development above to be really disconnected from the civic life beneath, and I made it very open and very transparent, very accessible, and then on the inside developed this large table, basically one big table. So the entire library is actually a table, and everybody can come and gather around this table. And so we organized all the different programs of the library around this table, which can be a place for study, but also a stage, a place for storage, a place for performance, etc. And so this is being developed. Now we're about to start our design development, and hopefully we start construction on this project soon. Next stop, Columbus, Indiana. Does anybody know who designed this fire station? Charlotte cannot say, join. Okay, good. All right. So, I don't know, so maybe some people have been to Columbus, Indiana. This is Venturi, Scott Brown. They designed a fire station in this very small town in Columbus, Indiana. Columbus, Indiana is 35,000 people, and it's basically a place of industry, and mostly a single industry, which is Cummins engines. And Cummins engines was made to what it is today by Mr. Joseph Irwin Miller, that you see here on the right. He was born into this family, but he didn't start the Cummins engines. His uncle had started it. Cummins was the mechanic, African-American mechanic of the Millers. But when he tinkered with the car and sort of adjusted the engine, he invented the diesel engine. And so the Miller said, well, that's an amazing invention. We should start this company. And they named it Cummins Engines, and it's one of the largest diesel factories or engine factories or companies currently in the world. And Miller also very much believed in the role of architecture in creating civic society. He was a very engaged, very progressive entrepreneur who really saw also his responsibility in shaping not just his factories, but also the town and the places where his workers and people would live. There were people that asked him to become president of the United States. He always refused. He always stayed in Columbus, and he built this city there. He invited great architects as Ariel and Eero Saarinen to build churches there. So on the left, the father, on the right, the dad or the son. He asked IMP to come and build a library there. There is, I think, 20 high schools, all paid for by Miller to bring in the best architects, and also the factory buildings themselves. Here on the right, Kevin Roche, one of the plants in the region. So every single piece of public infrastructure or public architecture, he would actually support and pay for the architect's fees and bringing the best architects that he could find to create this wonderful place for 35,000 people. He also built his own house, which is the Miller House, designed by Saarinen, and sort of a quite clear nine square grid with skylights all in the center. So here you come in, there's a big living room and a view, kitchen, master bedroom, kids' bedroom, servant quarters. This is in 1954, and is seen as one of the main highlights of early modern mid-century modern homes in the U.S. When he died, or first he died, and then Xenia died, his wife. And she was very much the driver of this design, and very much the driver also of bringing in these artists and bringing in these architects to work on these different projects. And then, so they brought in a group of people, and they started Columbus Design, or Exhibit Columbus, to celebrate the legacy of the Millers and of their sort of commitment to civic architecture. And this year, or this is the second year, last year they invited a number of architects to build an installation that responds to this legacy, that responds to this idea of design within the public realm and the role that we as architects can play within that. And so we were asked to do an installation that opened this summer there. And we took two cues in designing our installation. The first was working with the patterns that Alexander Girard, the interior designer, had developed together with Xenia Miller for the whole house. And the second was Dan Kiley, a famous modernist landscape architect that designed the gardens. And he had designed these hedges that sort of stagger, but the hedges were very much sort of a division between the private and the public. And on a tour there, we learned that the hedges need to be replaced. They need to buy new hedges. We have now decided that when we get engaged in temporary installations, that we always think about the afterlife of the installation, and that there is actually no, stuff that goes to the dumpster. And so it was very important for us in developing an idea for this project that we would think of what would be the afterlife of the installation. And when we heard that they were going to replant the hedges, we thought, why don't we give these hedges sort of a free life before they become a hedge? And what if we use the hedge itself actually as a space to gather? So rather the hedge as a space to separate the public from the public to the private, we said, what if you come into the hedge, and if the hedge itself becomes a space for gathering? Our site was on the main sort of city or town square next to the courthouse, and so it would be a very public and very sort of traveled space. And we set out this grid, and then we made a series of say, seating and a quilt, if you want, channeling some of the Alexander Girard patterns that turn into hammocks and places to sit and for engagement. And so here, another installation and the picture from the air, and we have another video here. Two more stops, one in the US and the other on the other side of the border, but they relate, and they relate, I think, to the entirety of this story, which I think have to do with industry, economy, people, access, etc. This is Indianapolis, the river that goes straight through the city, and on the left you see in a circle a gigantic building, this building, which is the Crane Bay, which is an empty 800 meter, no, that cannot be, I thought it was 800, it must be 800 feet, long structure, industrial structure. That was once part of the GM stamping plant. First, carriages were made here in the 1800s, and then in Chevrolet, they took over the site in the 1930s and made it a stamping plant, which means basically they stamp metal into pieces of cars and what have you. And one of the largest stamping plants of that time in the US. You see the trains coming in from the back. You see the polluted runoff water being dumped in the river sort of here on the front. And you see on the left, you see the neighborhood called the Valley, where most of the people that worked in this factory that occupied or employed 6,000 people at a certain time, they lived there. The building was designed by Albert Kahn, famous industrial architect. He has been called the architect of Detroit. He was there at the turn of last century and really innovated in industrial buildings. He introduced steel and concrete, where in the past it was wood and there was a risk of fire. He introduced a lot of daylight to really improve the conditions in which work was being done. And so this is a very important historic building on that site that is now left empty and barren. And so we participated or are participating in a competition which the jury is still out together with Scape, again a landscape architect, and the two other competitors are Snell Hetta and Walter Hood together with Thomas Pfeiffer. And so it was not so much just the idea of what to do with this crane bay, but that was our scope. It was much larger about what to do with the site, because there was a developer who had developed this plan to build an office park in this area. And then there was outcry, specifically by the residents of the valley. And here you see Jane and Renee. And they actually got really upset, and they said, this needs to change. We need to deal with this in a different way. And they started this group that then got involved in really rethinking what to do here. And so the three proposals, our proposal is trying to reduce sort of the say, high-rise office park quality and really try to tie it to the neighborhood itself. Also tie in, there's a bike path, sort of recreational path into the neighborhood itself that loops all the way through the city, and then sort of bring in different cultural highlights, different cultural spaces, really addresses it within this neighborhood. It's a strategy. It's not something that you suddenly will build, but an approach that allows this site to develop over time. We developed a bridge that connects the downtown to this area, and most importantly, we thought about what to do with this crane bay and how to transform it and reactivate it and make it a place for occupation. Initially very open and very temporary, and gradually transform it into a place for food, working, theater, art, and performance. And so in some way, taking that industry and industrial historic typology and opening it up, creating a sort of a new face and a new life into it. Opening up to the city, opening up to a square that Scape designed that connects to the river with a theater and maybe some ice skating in winter. We continued to Pittsburgh and to Fallingwater, and then made our trip back home. And Pittsburgh is important because, well, actually I will maybe just conclude by all of these things had obviously a lot to do with the automotive industry in this country. And as you know, many of these jobs left, and they left to other places. And this brings us to the last project, which is actually in Mexico, where we're currently working on a housing project. We're working on a housing project in this area called Guanajuato, and it's one of the fastest growing areas, mostly because most of the car industry moved actually here, and it's attracting a lot of migrant labor at this moment. And so the city of Leon, where we're working, they invited us to help think how they could work with this incredible sort of increase in migrant workers. Because in Mexico, there's something called Infonavit, and Infonavit is like the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They provide loans for people who want to buy their first home at sort of the lowest income level. And they describe a model, and this model that sort of gives them a loan has produced this type of neighborhoods really, really far away from the city centers, on the cheapest land, built the most, repetitive way, because this is the only way that a developer can make sort of the loan conditions meet and give people with incomes that are less than $7,000 a year a home. But the problem of these homes is that they are so far away from facilities that cities can't actually maintain them anymore. And very quickly they turn into sort of really difficult neighborhoods, because they can't bring schools there, they don't have the resources to pick up the trash, there's no security, there's no transportation, and they turn in very not necessarily giving people the upward mobility that these neighborhoods were supposed to deal with. And so we were asked to come to the city of León and help the different stakeholders there think how they could think of vertical, more dense housing, but closer to the city center itself. In order to allow these people to be closer to their jobs, be closer to transportation, and just be part of the community itself. And so there's all these different stakeholders, banks, landowners, politicians, city government, resident organizations, etc. And so how to have these people have a conversation with one another and have them understand what is important from their point of view. And what we did is we developed a game, and we basically gave everybody 2 possible sites, a number of tools. Actually, we gave them scissors and we gave them glue, and we gave them a task to find a way to accommodate a certain amount of housing on that site in dialogue with each other. And so rather than having people make their points, make their political speeches, make their statements, actually through the game and through working together, they were able to understand the other person's point of view. And this was a very successful session and very successful afternoon. And so they asked us, why don't you guys do one of these homes or houses or housing on one of these sites? And so the brief is 60 homes, and the budget is $2 million total. So that's very, very tight. But that's the price point at which this thing can work. We, with housing, are quite explicit that we try to avoid the double-loaded corridor at all costs, because the double-loaded corridor is the most dreadful space one can imagine, specifically between the street and one's front door. And so we've, in many of our housing projects, tried to really think of ways to avoid this double-loaded corridor. And so specifically because of the climate, we were able to work with a courtyard typology, one that actually has the circulation at the exterior. But we also wanted to give this building somewhat of its own identity, so that people would be proud and would be able to identify where in the building they lived. And through a number of different study models, we were able to come to a form that is both sort of coherent and working together, and at the same time it sort of consists of different parts, so that you don't end up living in one gigantic block, not being able to identify with your own home. 2 courtyards that bring in daylight and natural ventilation to both ends, and so a single loaded corridor that you see here, swinging both in and out, sort of weaving through and around these 2 courtyards. You enter the building from underneath. Here there is some commercial space. This is the 2nd floor, but there's some commercial space and a community room over here. You enter, there's the stairs, and there's another staircase, which I will talk about in a little bit, taking you up. And very important, so that single-loaded corridor with cross ventilation. Most of the homes are either 2 or 3 bedroom because of the family makeup there. And we decided to rotate and make not the windows straight on the corridor, but actually on a corner, so that people wouldn't necessarily be staring straight into your home. Here, a number of communal spaces as you go up. So within the building, some of the rooms are left empty and exterior, and they can be used for communal programs such as cooking or playing games outside. So here and all the way up to the building. And so they were very enthusiastic about this, and we, because of we thought we should build this mostly out of concrete because that's something they understand, and we wanted to work with precast concrete panels to make the facade that would allow for an efficient installation, we thought. And everybody said, great, that's a good idea, and we started to work with a team. And then they made a mock-up, and they said, this is the mock-up on the right of our precast panel. And we said, well, that's not right. And they said, yeah, well, they said, to be honest, there's one company that can do these panels, and they're in Guadalajara, and that's a 3.5-hour drive, and the panels need to be installed by crane. And so in order to get one panel from the factory installed into the building, it's the same as employing 30 people for 30 days right here. And so then we thought, okay, that's probably a better way to go. Why don't we, develop a way of building this building that the entire community can actually participate and actually benefit from the construction of this project itself. And so we said, how much, can one person carry, which is 17 kilos? So then we worked to develop a block, actually a custom precast concrete block that weighs exactly 17 kilos, so that one person can install this. And we also developed a custom block, which is a sort of pentagonal-shaped block that allows to negotiate the sort of curvilinear plan that we have. So in a way, it's sort of like it's like a dial that allows to rotate the facade around this curvilinear perimeter. And so this was developed together with one company, and this is the entirety of the facade. So because of the very mild climate, this is all that is needed as sort of the border between interior and exterior. I was very excited we could also develop with local workshops steel frame windows with a very sort of old school way of opening with a hook, and now there's a bunch of local craftsmen welding these windows together. And so this is the new render with the corrugated stone block facade, the exterior and the interior, and the pictures of a few days ago where the project is going up and will be completed sometime next year. And so that's it for today. Thank you. Go ahead. I'll take some questions if you want. Yeah, it's okay.
Maybe it would be helpful for our group, because I know that it's made up of a lot of first issue here, for you to help them understand the development of practice.
So you say I should do the other lecture as well, maybe, or not, the first one. Yes and no. I think what I was trying to introduce in the beginning is that we were always very engaged in sort of really operating in the sort of muck, so to say, of society, if you know what I mean, and not isolate ourselves into representational games or paper architecture. I think what is exciting now is that this, well, let's see. We're working in many different places at this moment, and we're engaged in a really wide variety of projects, and all of them in some way are dealing with, say, mess that has been left behind. So in some way it's about fixing things, not fixing, but sort of engaging with histories, engaging with ways in which we as humans have acted prior, right? So there's no empty site, there's no clean slate. We're and sort of this realization maybe, or just the development of our practice into, like engaging with these narratives, I think it's much stronger now than it maybe was before. But I don't know if that really helps clarify what you wanted me to say. I mean, I can go to the previous lecture and show some beautiful images, but yeah. I don't know who was first. You go first.
That way it gets on. Thank you for the lecture. Is this working?
I hear you.
Okay. Thank you for the lecture. Just to sort of piggyback off of Chris's question and to acknowledge that there are a lot of first years here who, at least in my studio, we talked about your projects going into this lecture, and a lot of them expressed surprise at the varying sort of scales of work, and also some of the installations, which to them it doesn't resonate with what their understanding of architects' work is. And I'm curious whether you can expand more on this relationship in your practice between installation work and what might be considered more conventional or traditional building work, and whether you see those projects talking to one another, whether that's something that you may learn.
Thank you, because that was indeed the point I was trying to make with touching on those three temporary installations. I think obviously nothing is permanent, right? So the fact that in some way every installation is a temporary installation, and so I think that's also what in sort of responding to Chris, we are now engaged with the ends of other, for instance, the Crane Bay in Indianapolis is also a temporary installation, if you think about it, just over a very long period of time. And I think that idea or that notion that there are, various times in which you as an architect can engage with. I mean, for us, this is a really important aspect of the practice that we really enjoy. So thinking about the relationship between time and material, also like the amount of material you invest, for a certain amount of time into changing a space, into transforming a space. So I hope and I think it's important for students to realize that there is not such a difference between something that is, for a short period of time or a longer period of time, if you think about it in that way. But the things that are of shorter time periods, they allow you to do more experimentation. People tend to be more open for saying, well, this is just temporary, right? So let's try something new. And so we use these really to try out things, to examine maybe new techniques, maybe new materials, maybe new approaches, maybe new ways of engagement. So I think we continue to do them. Actually, we're working on three, other larger but temporary installations as well. And I think it's a very productive space for architects to start to work in, but also to continue to work in, to not just do it in the beginning in order to get to sort of real buildings. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's really the space where it actually allows you to really experiment with many different things. So I don't know if that answers the question, but it is something that for us is very important to continue to do. And actually, I'm excited to say that now there's a museum in Europe that will have actually a show of only our temporary work, which means we have to really go dig back into stuff we have done over the past 10 years and focus on that aspect, which, I don't know, I'm very glad we're not only doing temporary installations. So I'm really happy that we're able to create these projects as well. But I think that the two are really important for us to keep together. Yeah.
I had a few questions about your first project, the Kukje Gallery.
Yeah.
Right now in my design class, we're analyzing that building and the concept and the materials behind it.
All right.
And my question was, what inspired you to push all the programs out of the building and connect it with the mesh?
This is this project.
Yeah.
This was our first project. And well, let's see. So this is a very particular historic neighborhood, quite beautiful neighborhood in Seoul, Korea, which has a very refined texture and sort of the grain of the fabric is very, like it's old historic. You see a little bit the homes there on the site. And spaces for art, especially contemporary art, are typically a big box without, any specificity, right? The more neutral the box, the more it can accept any type of art. So the white cube is considered the most neutral form, so to say, to allow different art to be displayed. And so we were very concerned about placing this gigantic box, in this neighborhood. There was very little other program necessary except for basically the clients that make the biggest box possible. And so we wanted to find a way to soften the edge of the box. And so by pushing everything out and then, making this, the ambition was to make sort of a permanent mist or a permanent fog around this edge. And so we worked indeed with craftsmen to weld these 500,000 rings together to drape this, drape the edge. And so these elements, they help sort of animate and soften that edge. Yeah.
Thank you. My other question was, what materials were used for the roofing? I saw a section of the building and I saw it is sloped down.
Sorry, for
and
that?
it has
the roofing.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a skylight. So basically,
Yeah.
you can take the stairs up here to the roof. But yeah, I only have one image today. But there's a skylight at the perimeter, so that runs around on the top, and that slopes in so that the water doesn't go into the gallery, but goes into the drain. Yeah.
My other question was, what were the materials for the wall itself of the building?
This is concrete on the outside, and then on the inside there's studs with then a layer of plywood and then sheetrock. So plywood is necessary so you can hang art anywhere, and sheetrock absorbs white paint quite well. And then the outside is concrete, and then this is stainless steel rings.
Thank you.
Over there.
I'm curious about, you had in a few of the projects, you had this format where you, in a few of the projects you had a format where you elicited feedback from certain constituent groups. And I'm curious about I guess the particular scenarios in which they happened, and maybe at what step in the design process did those happen. And you, I think a couple times mentioned that you had a game prepared for the groups. So I'm just wondering also if this is something that kind of fit the particular circumstance in that case, or is that something that you are kind of developing into your design practice for all projects? Or, I mean, how is that influencing, I guess, your working method?
I think that's a very good question that I haven't really thought about yet. But what we mostly discover is that these days it's very hard for people to have conversations, specifically when the projects that I'm showing engage multiple audiences and multiple points of view. And we find that people are very good to articulate, what they want, but it's harder for them to understand, other people's point of view. So what we realize is that often these sessions are also just necessary for people to be able to, articulate what they care about, and that they want to make sure that they are heard. What we, for instance, Art Park, the project we're doing in Buffalo at the Niagara Falls, is a big project with a lot of different points of view and a lot of different stakeholders. And what we're feeling is that we go there, we go back, and it has truly affected the way we're thinking about it. And we are completely now trying to actually weave their narratives into the proposition and in some way cater to these different audiences, because we realize that that's the only way in which something like that will ultimately survive and be a success, if it becomes their project and if people recognize, their voice in it. Obviously, this is also difficult because you can't just design by committee, etc. A park is a big thing. A park can accommodate many different activities, so it's maybe different. I think it works on these larger scales. But we also realize we're doing a project in Melbourne now, also on that scale. It's an incredible amount of work, and it is something that I think I'm not sure if we want to continue, or if this is sort of the scale that we will ultimately go towards. It's more for us now discovering what it actually takes to engage with such large groups of audiences. So I don't know yet. I don't think we're gonna, I don't think it's necessarily good to design everything by committee, but I do think it's really important to figure out a way to listen and to also be able to have people have conversations with one another, because I think it's quite necessary at that moment in time. Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously also quite a lot of criticism about it, because as you say, at a certain point you need to take decisions, but it's great if it's informed decisions, but you can never, everyone who participated will be happy. But I think there needs to be a moment of judgment where one can also make a synthesis and a decision about.
Yeah, the other day I was saying, I think actually our job now is not to create sort of new forms or new images, but actually to create new stories. And I think that's where maybe listening helps, so that it allows you to create new stories. And I think that's maybe how it's affecting our practice, is that we are maybe realizing that it's very important to develop sort of new narratives that people can engage with.
I think that was a nice last word. No?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.